Welcome and thank you for joining us for this webinar presentation. We are the Homeland Defense and Security Information Analysis Center, or HDIAC, one of 3 IAC domains in the DoD Information Analysis Centers operating under the Defense Technical Information Center, DTIC, within the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. Our informative webinar series highlights current and emerging research and technology developments. It presents an opportunity for accelerating the DoD's leverage of these advancements by increasing awareness and fostering technical collaboration. HDIAC serves as one of the premier information research partners and curators of technology advancements and trends for the Homeland Defense and Security community. As such, our organization supports those working in the Homeland Defense and Security domain of DoD research and engineering. We do so by helping navigate the vast landscape of scientific and technical information, allowing our customers to get a head start on their technical projects. With an understanding of the Homeland Defense and Security DoD research and engineering landscape, we provide research and analysis services. We help unlock access to information, knowledge, and best practices from government, industry, and academia to stimulate innovation, foster collaboration, and eliminate redundancy. We hope you enjoy this webinar presentation and that it serves as a catalyst for community collaboration and improved DoD Homeland Defense and Security research.
Okay, good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar presentation. My name is John Clements, and I'm the technical lead for HDIAC. Before we get started, I just want to note a couple of administrative items. Unlike most of our webinars, we actually don't have a slide presentation for this one. It is going to be a little more dynamic and live. So unfortunately, that means there's no slide presentation for you to go and download off of our website to be able to follow along. But our presenter is going to walk you through everything, and it should be good. And if you have any type of issues seeing what's going on, you can put it in the chat, and if we don't get it resolved, have no fear, because we'll have it up on our YouTube site within a couple days, if not sooner. So you'll be able to go back to the HDIAC YouTube channel and watch the full presentation there. Also, I would like to just point out that all participants are muted, but you can chat with the presenters and the host using the chat function to the right. If you would like to submit a question for the Q&A session that'll happen at the end, I would ask that you use the Q&A function. It's at the bottom right of the screen. There's a 3-dot ellipses menu, and if you click on that, you'll see the Q&A listed there, and that's the best way to guarantee that I can see and get to your question. Otherwise, I think we are ready to get started. And first, I would like to introduce today's webinar presenter, and it is Sam Powers. And Sam Powers is a published expert in open source intelligence and manages a public sector business at Caron, where he maintains relationships and expands the company's technology across the government. He previously worked at Data where he managed relationships across the public sector and non-governmental / international organizations, and worked as an analyst focused on criminal organizations and terrorist groups' social media use. He is an affiliate of New York University's Initiative for the Study of Emerging Threats. And with that, Sam, I will turn it over to you. Please take it away.
Hey everyone, thanks a lot for joining, and John, thanks for hosting. Happy Tuesday. Yeah, thanks a ton for joining. So today, as John began to detail, we're going to be looking at 2 things: FOCI and export control. And I'll go over these a bit. For some on the line, this will be a bit of a refresher. For some, these are terms that you've heard every day in your work life. But what we'll do is we'll go through the current state of play, and we'll go into some live demonstrations leveraging open source. So we'll examine the risks posed by foreign ownership and control and export control evasion as adversaries seek to exploit vulnerabilities, influence critical infrastructure, and acquire sensitive U.S. technology. Public and private organizations must remain vigilant. To stay ahead of these threats, organizations must proactively identify risks, enforce export controls, and prevent the diversion of technology and other items. Open source, OSINT, has become a critical tool in this fight, providing real-time insights to enhance compliance, strengthen due diligence, and expose illicit procurement networks. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to start with a FOCI and export controls one-on-one. So we'll talk about what is FOCI and export controls. Again, for some of you, these are terms you deal with every day. And what do we need to ultimately understand about key regulations and enforcement? We're also going to look at what's changing in 2025. As everyone knows, we're in a new administration. So we're going to be looking at new controls, new restrictions, and evolving policies as we move into 25. And we're also going to look at how open source intelligence can help. And what I'll be doing is going over a few case studies to see how OSINT can ultimately help with compliance and risk mitigation. So let's start with FOCI. So foreign ownership, control, or influence, FOCI, occurs when a foreign entity, whether a state-backed investor, adversarial government, or proxy organization, gains the ability to direct or influence the business decisions of a U.S. company. Ultimately, this can pose a significant national security risk, particularly when the company operates in government contracting, critical infrastructure, emerging technologies like software, quantum, and AI, or defense-related industries. What are export controls? So export controls help regulate the transfer of sensitive technologies, goods, and data to foreign entities. These regulations prevent adversarial nations from acquiring critical defense, aerospace, and dual-use technologies, one that we'll touch on particularly today, that can ultimately be used by our adversaries for military, intelligence, and other purposes. So I want to start with a bit of, the regulatory landscape and enforcement landscape for FOCI and export controls separately. So for FOCI regulation and oversight, the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, DCSA, enforces FOCI regulation for companies handling government contracts under the National Industrial Security Program Operating Manual, also known by the acronym NISPOM. CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment and Relations in the United States, reviews and, when necessary, blocks foreign investments in critical industries that pose national security risks. From an export control enforcement standpoint, the Bureau of Industry and Security, also known as BIS, and OFAC, as well as other government agencies, enforce key export control laws, including Export Administrative Regulations, EAR, and International Traffic and Arms Regulations, also known as ITAR. These control dual-use technologies like semiconductors, aerospace components, and advanced manufacturing tools. There's also the military end-use rule, which restricts U.S. exports to China, Russia, Venezuela, and other military-linked entities, and then various sections of the NDAA, such as 1260H, which increase scrutiny on Chinese military-linked companies, specifically prohibiting U.S. firms from exporting restricted technologies. Now, as we move into 2025, as you've seen in the news, things are changing a bit. So as we go into the year, things like tighter FOCI regulations will become commonplace. The America First investment policy will expand restrictions on U.S. companies with foreign ownership, especially in critical sectors like semiconductors, AI, quantum computing, and biotech. We're also going to see restriction on greenfield investments. That is foreign investments in new U.S. facilities, especially around places like military bases, especially in certain sectors, will now face heightened scrutiny, ensuring adversarial nations cannot establish footholds in these critical sectors. CFIUS enforcement is also ramping up, so we'll see expanded authority to investigate and block transactions even after they have been completed if national security risks emerge. And we'll also likely see increased mandatory reporting requirements for companies with foreign investors tied to adversarial governments. On the export control front, we're likely to see expanded restrictions on common high priority list, also known as CHPL items, including advanced semiconductors, aerospace components, defense materials, and critical telecom infrastructure to prevent any unauthorized military applications. New listings and sanctions targeting front companies and shell companies used to bypass export laws will also come into place, and we're likely to see stricter military end use, again, MEU rules, making U.S. exporters responsible for ensuring their products do not indirectly support foreign military programs. So we're likely also going to see a lot of enhanced supply chain vetting requirements, increasing due diligence obligations for companies involved in dual-use technologies, as well as ramping up of KYC, know your customer requirements for exporters to assess and verify more thoroughly before shipping sensitive technology. So that was a lot to kind of digest in a very quick time. I'd like to, go over broadly before I go into some use cases about how open source intelligence can help. As we all know, OSINT has been around for a while. I started my career, looking at jihadist terrorism and narco-terrorism as it relates to OSINT. Everything from social media to publicly available shipping data, to tender data, to media articles, all of this information can be utilized to help mitigate FOCI risks and also avoid export control violations. So with OSINT, and leveraging bulk PAI, we can do things like conduct due diligence. Who does a partner or supplier have relationships to? We're able to identify foreign influence in corporate structures, look at things like board members, look at things like CEOs, and ultimately where someone might have, say, gone to university. Do they have a tie back to, a certain military or a certain university supported by the military? We're also able to look at trade records, much of which is public, procurement data, regulatory filings, and then also expose vulnerabilities within the supply chain to detect things like illicit export risks and factors that might interrupt global supply chains across the world. So by leveraging real-time intelligence, OSINT can help government as well as industry prevent unintentional violations of export control as well as enforce FOCI. So what I want to do right now is, before I close, just show what I'm going to do. So here at Charon, we leverage publicly available information, and I'm going to show part of the capability called Clearview, which will give a look into how we leverage open source intelligence to essentially map out FOCI risks as well as export control risks. So if I can just share my screen. All right. So again, as John mentioned in the beginning, this information is going to be up on YouTube. If you can't see it or you're having difficulty, please give us a shout. We can obviously share this information and provide demos. John has my contact and I can put it in the chat later. But ultimately what you're looking at right now is a screenshot from Charon's Clearview tool. And in this case, we have a map, a chart that I'm going to dig into a bit, and there's going to be specific carve-outs here. But we have a series of companies based in China, specifically in Beijing, that are owned by the same individual called Li Xie. Now, if I were to click on any of the nodes here, particularly this company highlighted in yellow, Beijing Huarui, I would begin to see some connections related to things that we might consider risky. So as I mentioned earlier, Beijing Huarui is owned by Li Xie, who also owns another company based in China called Agenix Semiconductor Co. These two companies share a location in Beijing. Now, Chinese companies owned by the same individual that might work with the PLA or another organization, that's interesting. And I'm going to get into why this matters in a bit. But as we look at Beijing Huarui over on the right, we see some risk typologies and corridors that might bring this to concern more quickly. So I go down and I can see properties about this company. I can see that Beijing Huarui had former names. I can see that they're located in Beijing. I can see registration numbers, and it would be important for me to note that all of this information is coming from publicly available information in China. Now, as I build this out, I begin to look at certain edges, as we refer to them here, between Beijing Huarui, again, that company, and vendor relationships and other relationships that we have. So in this case, Beijing Huarui is reported as achieving full military coverage, including the Central Commission, theater commands, military services for the Chinese Military Commission. So as I can see here, this is just coming from Chinese stock data, right? The Shenzhen Stock Exchange in particular. Now, if I go over here, I can map out more information. I can see that by looking at publicly available Chinese procurement data, we're able to see that Beijing Huarui participated in a November 2021 bid, which they received first place for an object-oriented multi-view description combat system. So this company is actively engaging with the Chinese military, putting out tenders, winning bids, and even further, if I go here, I can see that they retain various permits for weapons and equipment system production, what's known in China as GJB. This is going to entitle this company to be able to work on certain things, especially at the classified level in China with the PLA. And again, this is just coming from corporate disclosures, easy, information that you can access So as I zoom out again, I want to highlight the fact that drawing attention to the shared ownership. So this individual, Li Jie, who's not on any government list, for example, is the owner and controller of both of these companies. Now, as we move down the left-hand side of the screen here, we see that Eugenic in particular has exposure to various risks in Charon's system for MEU, Chinese government, and retains corridors to various actors, but ultimately is the owner of another Chinese-based firm, which for the purpose of this demonstration, we will redact. Again, on further calls, I'm happy to explain, more of who these companies are. For the purpose of this call, there'll be a few names that will be redacted, including this firm. So Eugenic is the 61.72% owner of this China-based semiconductor firm. And as I can see here, just a little bit more information about Eugenic. I can see that they had an AKA. They were formerly known as this company, and they are also based in Beijing. Now, as I look at the Chinese-based semiconductor firm, again, the one that we'll remain nameless for now, I can see that they also retain risk, including relationships to the Chinese government and various corridors. And this company is the 100% owner of a US-based firm that works in the semiconductor space. So before I proceed here, I just want to really kind of replay what we built out. We were able to understand fully through open source that a Chinese national, Li Jie, who is not on any government lists at the current moment, for example, an OFAC list or even an HMT Treasury list, right, is the controlling party of two organizations in China, and the owner of one, Eugenic Semiconductor Co. in Beijing, Huarui. They're located at the exact same building in Beijing. One of these companies has active engagement with the Chinese military. Now, one of Li Jie's companies owns another semiconductor company in China that is then the 100% owner of the US-based firm. Now, on the board of that US-based firm is a gentleman named Zhang Xiansong. And if I see here, they're listed as a director. Now, what I want to break out in this red box is an issue of concern, right? Because we have this individual, again, not on a government list. They go by this AKA. We could see that they're born in 1979. I'm blocking out some information here, but ultimately we're pulling this data from that US firm's website as well as some other Chinese data. And we're able to see that Zhang here manages Beijing E-Town International in China, which ultimately through various owners is overseen by the China State-Owned Assets Supervision and Administration Commission. So this US-based company not only has ownership from a Chinese-based semiconductor firm, but has an individual on their board who is the Chinese national who essentially is a manager of a company that is owned by the state. Now, this US-based firm has a partner in the US, and as I go here, I can see a little bit more information. But if we wanted to look at, another way of leveraging OSINT, we can see here that the US-based firm that partners with another US-based firm is ultimately retaining, as of 2024, over 1,000 contracts with the US DoD specifically for microcircuits and transistors. So I'm going to pause there. I bet there's questions. We'll leave them to the end. But again, if you couldn't see certain things in the charts, we can obviously share information after and go into specific detail. Now, if I move over to the next one, obviously, as I mentioned with my 2025, recap, there's increased concern specifically over software. So again, we've redacted a few names here, but I do want to highlight, a few things in this chart. So we have a Chinese-based firm at the top of the chart here, and as I build this out, I can learn a little bit more about that firm, who they work with, business associates, et cetera. I see here that they have a link to some of these risk typologies that we have here in Charon Clearview. And if I go over here, I can see that they retain 100% ownership through Chinese corporate disclosures of a US-based firm that sells products to the government of Canada and the US DoD. And if I go over to the right-hand side, I can see a little bit more about this firm. I can see where they're located, but I can also see what they are selling. So I can see that based on a brochure that was made publicly available, this US-based firm owned by the Chinese software company was in fact advertising what they have sold to the government of Canada via a brochure. And I can see with the DoD between 2018 and 2023, they had sold PDF compressors and enterprise server annual support. Now, the issue, to expand upon here is that this company is the owner, vendor, and partner of Hunan Wendu Information Technology Company. So I, can expand a little bit more on Hunan Wendu, and all to say that this Chinese-based software company that's selling in the DoD is maintaining this ownership, and partnership with Hunan Wendu. And each of these vendor edges that you see over on the left-hand side will actually indicate how these companies, or how Hunan Wendu works, sells, and partners across the Chinese defense industrial base. So if I look at the relationship between China Electronic Information Industry Group, I can see that according to a website for Hunan Wendu, and again, down here, China Electronics Corporation was a customer. This is information that was originally publicly available in Chinese. I can see here that the National University of Defense in China was labeled as a typical customer. And as I go on and on, I can see the different angles that this company is taking in publicly listing who they are supporting here. One that I want to draw attention to, obviously, is that this company is selling to China State Shipbuilding Corporation Group, which is ultimately a vendor to the PLA. So again, I'm gonna pause briefly while I pull up another screen. What we've touched on here are issues related to FOCI in particular. I'm gonna jump into an export control evasion case, and then we'll leave time for Q&A and any other questions. So let me just pull this up, and this is going to actually be a live demonstration of the Clearview platform. So in this case, we have a much more simple chart. And what I want to do here is highlight ultimately how some of our adversaries or organizations that are sanctioned either by the Treasury or other government entities may be working proactively to source common high priority list items, other items that enable certain entities to do what they do, especially in Russia. So what we're going to do is start here with a company called Al Bayt Al Khaliji General Trading LLC. And if I click on this company, I can see very quickly that they're on the OFAC SDN list. And if I go over here, I can scroll down and see things like sanction notes, why they're sanctioned. I can also see, interestingly, that this company maintains multiple addresses across the world. They have an address in Europe. They have an address in Sharjah in the UAE, and they also have a warehouse in Sharjah. They use multiple languages and, were known formally by a Russian AKA, multiple websites. And as I go down here, I can see all the citations. Now, what's important to note here is that this company is selling to a non-listed entity, which is Avtoperovsky OOO, a company that is based in Yekaterinburg, Russia, and is doing business across the world. So what we're able to do, again, looking at publicly available data, is understand what Al Bayt Al Khaliji is sending specifically to Avtoperovsky. So between a period of June 2022 and April 2024, there were 1,348 shipments using these HS codes, some of which are common high priority list items. We're able to list out and understand what we're seeing. So things like fuel pumps and oil filters and bearings, many items that are actually prohibited from entering certain entities within Russia, from companies including Manitowoc and other American companies, Japanese companies, and European companies. And as we scroll down, we can see more and more about that information. Now, Avtoperovsky is selling to Rusatom. Rusatom itself is not sanctioned, but they are owned, as I can see through the ownership percentage here, by Umatex JSC. And if I scroll over here, I can see that Umatex is in fact an OFAC SDN. They're on the UK Asset Freeze Target, and they're listed as an MEU as well. Now, this company owns Alabuga, which, as we probably know, has been sanctioned for their involvement in the production of Russian drones in particular. So again, just a very simple chart to kind of indicate how one entity, that might be seemingly innocent, is actually transferring goods to another entity, which may ultimately end up in the hands of adversaries. Thanks. So that's all that I have in terms of sharing. John, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here if that's all right. I definitely want to leave some time for Q&A. So
Sure
There's
thing.
probably a ton.
There's definitely a handful. So we'll get started right away.
Sure.
So first question, uh, keeping the cancellation of FCPA in mind, do you expect compliance requirements on dual use and FOCI to tighten?
I do. So, when we look at what is ending up in the hands of our adversaries, right? We do see, continued use of dual use technology, both from the United States as well as our allies, ending up in the battlefield. And ultimately, this administration has prioritized, ensuring that these goods are not finding their way there. So I anticipate, increased export control restrictions on top of what, BIS has already been enforcing to prevent certain products, including things like semiconductors, from entering, the supply chain for our adversaries. Great question.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And this is actually a question I started to come up with, and then one of the other attendees asked it. And essentially, how can we assume that the publicly available data is true? Like, how do they
Yeah,
get around misinformation?
it's a great point. So, from our end, right here at Caron, it's critical for us to have what we call a human in the loop. So while we leverage data science and NI in-house to, look at troves and troves of data and ensure that we are up to date and speedy, for us, it's very critical that an analyst sit between, what ends up on a user or a client's desk and what is in our system. Because per your point, there's tons of misinformation, there's tons of disinformation. So providing, an additional human lens on top of what data science may be able to provide, for us at least, is critical.
Great. Um, so the next question, how is the trade secret issue in China navigated, or the certain issues with outside patents?
That's a great question. So I can comment on the fact that, you know, from our end, we're able to, see when there are certain patents for military technology and certain permits that are authorized, by the Chinese government for a certain company to produce products. These are things that we might see sometimes after a, patent is awarded to a U.S. firm. But ultimately, what you're able to do leveraging PAI, right, is really get an insight, a window into what might be coming down the pipe, within our adversaries. What things are new on the market, how those things compare to, recently released or novel technology, or what we would think would be novel technology in the States or within our allies. PAI really provides a window into those things through things like tender data, shipping data, as well as patent data.
Awesome. So this one actually interesting because you focused on China in the presentation, but they're asking, are we using this approach to track any country exporting their products through third countries because the original country has tariffs or sanctions for exporting products to the U.S.?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, we see transshipment as a major issue. Because especially if you look, I'll use China as an example and then try to zoom out a little bit. But, with the enforcement of the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, for example, UFLPA, the Xinjiang region in China came within center scope, for the production of goods using forced labor within the Uyghur minority. And what did a lot of companies do? They wanted to continue to work in Xinjiang, but they wanted to make sure their goods were clean before they enter the market. So we saw various countries popping up across the world, that would essentially serve as the conduit between, someone doing a bad thing and ultimately letting the product get to the market. We see the same thing with goods leaving shores of the United States or our allies, where, it's not illegal for American firms or other Western firms to do business with certain countries. It's not enforced, right? But if those countries are then being used as a ground to send those products to entities that are high risk, then it becomes a major issue and a bit of, honestly, a bit of a whack-a-mole, where you're going to have to be looking at, certain entities within these countries that might have previously been friendly. But if you look at something like, the invasion of the Ukraine may have switched overnight from importing one thing to then serving as a conduit for, Russian weapons manufacturing. And a lot of these firms made a ton of money doing so, right? Because all of a sudden, certain products couldn't find their way into Russia, so there needed to be a series of entities that were actually, stood up to support that.
Wonderful. Good answers. Another question that a couple people reiterated. Does this program or do you find the information for you and organize it, or do you have to insert any of the information yourself?
Yeah, so as I mentioned previously, we leverage, a data science team and AI in-house to look at, tons and tons of data, which we house in what we call our core, so our repository of information that has millions and millions of links between entities and hundreds of thousands of nodes. But ultimately, before something is published, we would want to have a human in the loop to look at, making sure that that information is actually published for the viewer, i.e. the analyst, with a level of diligence behind it so that we can check for, things that were mentioned before, misinformation, disinformation, updates to things, and ensuring ultimately that what is viewed by our analysts and what is viewed by users across the world is relevant and accurate. Because as many on this call probably know, there's a ton of data out there, and the last thing we want to do is be in the business of providing wrong information, false positives, misinformation, etc.
Okay, the next question is with the data model for this graph, would someone be able to query or explore what DoD critical technology areas are relevant to different entities, such as different institutions, companies, etc.? So the way I'm understanding this is like, would you be able to look at a company and see what kind of backtrack what critical technology areas that company might have a role in or have interest in?
Yeah, absolutely, right. So, and again, for those that are interested, I can provide additional demos and we can stay in touch. But we are used by government really to look at relationships between entities and their wider ecosystem. So if we look at, major Chinese companies, thinking of AVIC, for example, by using our data, we're able to look at the various subsidiaries, industries that they're involved in, critical infrastructure that they might be supporting. These are, very priority items, obviously, not just for this administration, but for the entire global supply chain, really to understand that when you're doing business with an entity, regardless of where it's based, the ability to look at, how that company and its leadership sit within the supply chain and sit within, the ecosystem is very important. So yes, you're able to see, using this tool in particular, how one company or one entity might relate to various, sectors in particular through expanding the graph.
Brilliant. And the next question, I don't think you addressed this, but maybe you did. Are all the links between companies shown on your chart current, and how old do they have to be before you might delete them from the chart? Or how is that represented, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we're able to, we update our data frequently, and we don't like to remove data, right? And the reason I say that is because, if you're looking at relationships between entities, say for example in Russia, even though certain individuals might be delisted from a sanction or, unfortunately might be dead. These are relationships that might matter when you're conducting due diligence. So, if you look at the case of Prigozhin in Russia, he would still be in our data because he owned multiple companies that were previously sanctioned. And we want to be able to ensure that if there is a link between, say, a new company and a company that was previously owned by someone who's now deceased, that data isn't pulled for any specific reason. In terms of updating, it's a daily exercise, right? We need to make sure that our data is, as fresh as possible. So, new designations come down and sanctions, and we're able to update those, adhering to government guidance as we do. Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess a kind of follow on I have to that is there a display? And I apologize if you went over this, but is there a display to show like maybe how like stale a certain relationship is? So if you had a company that maybe sold to another company, but the last transaction we know of is 8 years ago, so maybe there's not a current relationship, but you're not really. Is there something that's immediately presented to somebody to show? Like, yeah, there was a link here, but it's kind of stale.
Yeah, so a couple things that are important. So in Clearview, and again, I can do subsequent demonstrations, right? We have a date, a timestamp as to when this information was published and when it was updated, right? And if something came out in 2018 and hasn't been updated since 2018, we'll say that it was published in 2018 because there hasn't been any update to it. But if something has changed and we update it, then we will reflect that timestamp. The other thing that we're able to do is be very clear in our sourcing. So if we have, a relationship between one entity and a vendor edge to another entity, that's going to tie back to a raw, publicly available information source that is clearly cited within Clearview. And we're able to talk with our client community about accessing that data and making sure that they can get value out of it. But it's very important for us as former analysts to be clear with our community on where we're pulling that data from within the chart.
Great, and thank you. And then another question: you discussed false positives. How are you, or is there a way of addressing false negatives in the data?
Yeah.
Now,
Now,
much harder.
no, you might need to help me out. You might need to help me out a little bit. False negative. Is there an example that you might provide where I can think about it? I'm just, you know, it would be helpful.
I guess
Yeah.
in this case, having insufficient data or having there be, you go and set up your dashboard or your view, and there's no link between two companies, but there in fact is a link. So we didn't find publicly available information
Yeah.
that company A shipped 300 lasers to company B, but then it comes to light later or something like that. I guess is there any way that you guys try to address that?
Yeah. So, you know, our research methodology is to continuously monitor really everything in the world, right? To make sure that we're updating the data, frequently. But we do have the ability for our, clientele to communicate with us directly if they are seeing something and they feel that it, should be published in our graph and it adheres to our research methodology, then we're able to have the conversation about what that would look like to add and then update the information accordingly and kind of run it to the ground, to ensure that there aren't missing pieces in that process. Great question.
All right. Um, I think that about covers it. So Sam, if you want to take a moment and you can drop your contact information in the chat, but that was a large amount of information in a short period of time. So again, as I said a few times, this should be up on our YouTube channel shortly. Hopefully, by tomorrow, but as soon as we can get it there, we'll get it there. And Sam, I really want to thank you. I think this kind of stuff is very, very important. I know, actually, you mentioned CFIUS. CFIUS did an HDIAC webinar, which is up on our YouTube channel. If people want to see what they actually do and how to prevent this dual use of technologies, or even just military technologies in general, from getting transferred to the wrong people. This is going to be critical in years and decades to come. But so thank you very much for the presentation.
You're very welcome. Thank you everyone for attending. I dropped my email there in the chat. I'm happy to send kind of a slick sheet and do subsequent demos. But thank you to DoDIAC and to the team here for putting this on. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.